For the new lover, male or female in Western culture, relationship and sexuality offers a series of pitfalls, often without any preparation or explanation. And having gone through all of these myself in one form or another, I wanted to lay these out here. I'll be glancing off to the left where I have some of this written down with some cues. The first thing to be aware of is that attraction equals attraction, lust equals lust, and love equals love. They are not synonymous. Sexuality is an amplification tool that can be used to escalate abuse and harm or escalate a nurturing and loving relationship, depending on the context in which it's used. And this brings up the next question, which is, what is love? And as a little bit of a subset, what is a healthy sexual relationship? And there's a couple of different mistakes that are common. The first is that love or health equals consent, that if two people consent, that it is therefore a loving relationship. And the challenge with this is that sexuality, meaning peak arousal and release, has a lot more to do with the inner template of masculine and feminine energy, which is often set in childhood with the parental-child relationship. The child is in the feminine position. The parent is in the masculine or more dominant position in that relationship. And many children survive by participating in or consenting in various forms of verbal, mental, emotional, physical, and at times sexual abuse. And so consent is quite possible with two people holding an abuse contract or simply not knowing the difference between abuse, violation, and nurturing. The second thing is, of course, is it lust? And again, one can have very high levels of lust through the release of adrenaline by reenacting abuse templates that have not been examined. Until an abuse contract and a healthy sense of relating with the masculine and feminine within both people is understood, it's very common for people to say yes to things that end up escalating pain. The second thing or third thing to examine would be the heart-mind-body balance, meaning that as sexuality comes on, particularly if it comes on rapidly in a first, second, or third date, the hormones and sensation levels are going to go up enormously. With that is going to come, in a healthy individual, feelings of attachment and feelings of emotional connection. However, if this spikes while the level of mental awareness or level of understanding of the other human being is stagnant, because sexuality does nothing for that. You can have 3 days of passionate sex with someone and not learn anything about their politics, their religion, their deepest feelings, their memories, etc. And this may create a very high level of sexuality and a feeling of closeness, because while you're having sex, if there is a certain amount of physical attunement, there's a sense of being on the same page. But as soon as the sexuality exits and you try and engage in the logistics of daily life, then all kinds of divergences come into place, because the default assumption of an emotionally and relationally illiterate human being, which we all are in our culture because we don't offer a single hour of scientifically or psychologically based relationship instruction in school and college. It's very much part of the cultural ethic to leave such feminine things to be sorted out by mostly error and kind of learning through bumbling around. Now, what this happens, or when this happens, it usually shocks one out of the sexual ecstasy and trance, and you realize that you're driving at high speeds, but the other person is making assumptions that you're just like them because you felt like them. You felt attuned while having sex, and the other person is assuming you're just like them, and they're assuming you're just like you, but of course you're not. No two minds are alike. No two lifestyles are alike. There's a whole variety of things, including the wounding, which has not been explored. Woundings being sensitivities that, if touched upon, elicit feelings of humiliation, embarrassment, shame. And these tend to be different and lead to misunderstanding and a crashing. The next, and usually what happens is people don't know how to navigate that. So the more meaningful and emotional and physical the sexual connection, the more important it is for them to get out of the relationship and avoid the other person, because every interaction out in the world is leading to these fissures and fractures. The other thing is that our culture is filled with shame and different layers. You can look at the culture like an archaeologist and find layer upon layer upon layer of sediment. Different taboos, that are coming back from several generations ago, newer trends that, are fashionable in one sector of the culture versus another. And these shames create a warping effect on the relationship. So, for example, a man growing up in the United States might feel or is likely to feel ashamed of having needs, having emotions, strong emotions particularly, which puts him in quite a bind, because his partner, through the enactment of sexuality, is eliciting deep emotions, but his cultural programming is telling him that he is worthless or worth less the more he feels. So there's a no-win situation, and he may push away at this point simply to avoid feeling worth less, feeling embarrassed of feelings and things of that nature. This can also relate to the dynamic of the secret relationship. Macho younger men in particular may discover that their sensitivity is in fact welcome by a partner who's attracted and wants to be close. And so this has to then be kept secret. So you have, the tapestry of comedy about, all the men that quietly and secretly admit to being in love or needing their partner, often when they need sex, behind closed doors, but out in public disowning the relationship. So creating a certain schizophrenia where the vulnerability and emotion is present in the sexual act or in the bedroom, but then disowned in reality. And this is jarring and confusing for the feelings of the other person, who don't shut down just because you're out in public. The mask goes up, but the feelings continue. The next issue, and this ties in with the first distinction between sexual consent not being necessarily healthy, is that all sexuality is a charge between the masculine and feminine inside each person being externalized. And so the template of the masculine relating to the feminine in both the female and the male, I'm not going to go into all the different language around same-sex relationships, but for same-sex relationships that have a strong sexual charge, there's a similar externalization of the masculine and the feminine. And for there to be a strong conversation, a strong relationship, a strong sexuality, one person at any given moment is going to be strongly in the masculine, the other is going to be strongly in the feminine. But these dynamics, even more so in men than in women, are going to tend to be destructive, because the feminine in men and in women in a chauvinistic culture is devalued, demeaned, misunderstood, uneducated, and something that is somewhat taboo. Real men don't have feelings. Real men don't cry. Real men don't need another human being. They're independent. And so the exoneration of the masculine in a chauvinistic culture to some extent leads both females and males to compete to be more masculine and to compete to be in the masculine position, particularly with modern feminism. And so there is a competition to be the one that suggests something, a competition to be the one that initiates something, and a reluctance to enter the state of responsiveness, of saying yes, etc., because that's feminine. In a polarity, someone needs to say how about it, and another person needs to say yes. Otherwise, you don't have flow. The one who says yes is occupying the feminine position. And for many men, the most sensitive aspects of their femininity have been deeply traumatized, shamed, and banished. You go to school and the most feminine boy is the target of bullying. And so you learn it's actually traumatic, meaning your social identity is literally pulverized to the degree that the most sensitive aspects of the feminine are acknowledged. And so it's not only low-ranking socially and culturally in a chauvinistic cult like our own, but it's traumatic. And so there's deep feelings of helplessness, deep feelings of grief, and deep feelings of pain, loneliness, isolation, as one enters the deeper realms of the feminine that are necessary for a relationship to grow. And so the sexuality that will tend to be strongest is the reenactment of the abuse of the feminine by the masculine, be it male or female. Whoever's playing the masculine role is going to tend towards the reenactment of the culture's abuse system, with things like "I don't need anyone," denying the part in them that needs desperately. But in not needing someone, perhaps the other person is left carrying the feeling of need for both of them, because the one is afraid of being caught in the shame of need, in the shame of vulnerability, in the shame of feeling helpless. The helplessness that comes, for example, as an identity is born to hold the relationship. And that identity is an identity that depends on the intercourse of the relationship in order to sustain itself. And so when that need is ignored, trivialized, and minimized, that identity starts to die, starts to wither. And that's, of course, a very painful feeling, which elicits more need, which, if need is taboo for one or both partners, is shoved under the carpet. And this reenacts the betrayal of the feminine by the masculine. This is one of the things that can be explored and understood in pornography. As a man or a woman, one of the things that will often lead to the peak arousal is one party raping, violating, abusing the feminine, whether that's in a man or a woman. If that's a dominatrix, wounding the little one, often, in some of those fantasies, the reenactment of the baby boy with the little bottle and stuff like that, and the harsh masculine mother rejecting and scorning. And there's a reconnection with that childhood drama and that childhood template that is very intense emotionally, but the intensity comes from reliving the violation, reliving the abuse as closely as possible, feeling familiar, and thus being attractive in a certain sense. The more traumatic the culture, the more we cling to what's familiar. But when what is most familiar is most abusive, which is common in an abuse cult, then the attraction is released by reenacting the abuse. So power dynamics are often externalizations of the helplessness of the childhood, dealing with dominant parents, some of which, vicariously enjoyed the helplessness, the suffering of their children as one of the few sources of power in a grown-up world where many grown-ups feel shunted around by their bosses, unable to speak up, unable to challenge their government that says you have to do this and this and this, or we'll throw you in jail, or we'll kill you, or we'll ostracize you, or we won't let you make a living, and then you'll be worthless and a loser. So the usury, the betrayal, and the abandonment of the feminine in childhood, more so with men, but often in women as well, as women learn in a chauvinistic culture that to be valued by their father or mother is to exhibit masculine traits. Often as a contractor working in the U.S., if a parent brags to me about their daughter, it's most likely to be in terms of she's a badass because she's more masculine than men. And those tend to be the women being bragged about. I don't hear parents in the United States boasting about their daughter, the sensitive, their daughter, the feminine, or their son, the artist, the sensitive artist, etc. And so there's a tendency to relive that pattern. The next thing comes into the fact that we all have different love languages. In the book, The 5 Love Languages, there's touch, words of appreciation, acts of service, romantic gifts, and quality time. There are actually a few others, and there's many different variations in this, but most people tend to have a hierarchy of a primary love language. For me, it begins with quality time. The next is words of appreciation. The third love language is touch. And so someone will be very successful with me if they extend large amounts of quality time. Within that time, if they honor and appreciate my positive strengths verbally, and if that goes well, then the next and most important thing is to initiate touch. But if someone comes on and wants to have sex with me without dialogue or without extending quality time, it's out of sequence. So I want the touch, but I want it on the other side of that. And of course, in a relationally unconscious culture, the idea of a love language is not even understood. And I think it's worth, jumping back to that first distinction of what is love. If it's not lust, it's what is love? And the philosopher, psychologist, perhaps anthropologist, Abraham Maslow, undertook to understand the hierarchy of human needs that would transcend culture and time. And hierarchy means you do one first, and when that's done, you do another, etc. And he came up with survival as a universal primary need, security of survival as the next need, a sense of love and belonging being the next need. And this is where chauvinism gets reintroduced, because if you're in a cult that says that being feminine is weak and too emotional and all of that, then to be loved and belonging or rank highly in the family hierarchy, because parents subtly and often quite blatantly express favoritism towards their children, is to be more masculine. And so the very need every child has for love and belonging shunts them towards the biases of the cult, which is a bias towards masculine energy. You will go out and learn public speaking, but you won't learn public listening. You will learn leadership, but you won't learn to follow with any competence or expertise. You will lead to initiate, but you won't learn to say yes with a sense of dignity. You may say yes as the abused pleaser. The pleaser is a persona that emerges in many abusive families, where the abuser is narcissistic and only grudgingly extends affection or praise to the child able to please and satisfy the parent's needs emotionally, physically, sexually, logistically. That if you meet my needs, then I'll give you some love and belonging. But it's done out of fear, fear of being hit, fear of the giants that grown-ups are in relationship to the child. So there's a sense of the higher ranking or valuable person is the masculine person. And this is, of course, portrayed in the stereotype of the 50s, go out and work, important man doing man's things, and the little woman, who stays home and does the feminine things. And isn't that nice and all that? But she's not, of course, as important as the man's thing, which is often more of the masculine role, the strategist, the linear thinker, the statistician, the mathematician, etc., the engineer. And so, many women may develop these traits simply to be valued in a culture that doesn't know how to to value the feminine. And after the need for love and belonging comes the need for self-esteem, to be the person you want to be and earn that through follow-through, etc. So you set a set of values, and then you earn that. If your value is looking good, which is a very chauvinistic trait, in the sense of it's all about the exterior image, as opposed to the inner quality. Then if you look good and wear the right makeup and the right outfit and all this, then you can say, well, I like myself because I am meeting my idea of a valuable human being. I should have this amount of money, I should have this amount of college degrees, I should be working this kind of job, because we all know that executives are more valuable than laborers, etc., which is again elevating the mind over the body as a pervasive form of chauvinism. And so the need for self-esteem, to like oneself, is often templated by the culture which dictates. There were some cultures that said that fat people were more valuable and attractive because it showed that they could feed themselves in a starvation period. And so fat people were more attractive. And now that we have an abundance of food, now skinny people are more attractive. And so the default mode of self-esteem is actually fitting other people's idea of the valuable person, which often has little or nothing to do with the temperaments and qualities needed to have a loving relationship. After meeting the need for self-esteem, which generally is what other people like as the default, and then we don't train ourselves to value who we value, which may have nothing to do with the culture, comes the need to develop our gifts, and to develop our gifts to an extent that we can start integrating and bringing them into the community and creating wealth, creating value for ourselves and others, which leads then to one of the last needs, which is to leave a legacy, to transcend the individual myopia. And individuality itself, the obsession with the individual, is part of chauvinism, because you don't get individuals without a culture that produces individuals. And one of the more funny dynamics, if you travel around the world as an American, is you can generally spot the Americans because they're all focusing on their preferences and their individuality, because they're born into a cult that obsesses about the individual more than the group, more than the family. So it's not really individuality at all. It's cult programming that just happens to be a cult programming that obsesses about the individual more than the group. And so you can tell who's in that group by who's obsessing about themselves the most. And as I say, it tends to be the more egocentric people tend to be Americans. It's not hard to spot an American around the world. And it's not hard to spot other cultures, but that are just as programmed into focusing on what they focus on. An Asian woman will almost always be focused on her family, not because she was born that way, but because it's been programmed in. And so to love someone is to facilitate their natural and healthy becoming as they meet their human needs to survive. Meaning, if your engagement with someone ups another person's chance to survival, then you are being loving. Whether you're in lust or not, whether you have sex or not, you're being loving. And here you come into an obvious discrepancy, because one of the things that piques high arousal and lust in many dissociated Westerners is, for example, risky sex. So let's have sex with a stranger on a plane, or go to a sex party and, you have no idea who you're having sex with or whatever. And of course, that facilitates a significantly higher risk of STIs, sexually transmitted infections and various things like that. So you're mutually reducing your probability of survival as an act of adrenaline. But obviously it's not love, because love is the disciplined and intentional behavior that increases both people's chance of survival. That's being loving. And the security of survival, and here again you have the romantic troubadour climbing the vine into the woman's bedroom. I need you, I've got to have you right now, which is very romantic in an abstract or in a cultural sense. And yet, what if that's causing her to lose, to not pass her grades? I had a friend in the Philippines where an American teacher came over and was seducing her, and he was demanding that she have sex with him the night before she had a very important exam for her job. And she explained, of course, that she had to prepare. This was, a pivotal point in her career. He had absolutely zero interest in, who cares if she had a good career or a bad career? He wanted that, that sex right now. And here again, the divergence between lust or addiction and, being loving. And so the feminine is the one that says yes in both men and women. So the femininity in her in an abuse dynamic could say, okay, you really want me? Yes, I will do that. But in the dynamic of a healthy growth cycle, meaning a healthy internalized relationship with the masculine and feminine, is that the masculine in the female and in the male, in oneself and externalized, loves, cares about, and protects and advocates for survival, security, a sense of love and belonging. Here again, I think it would be a great, exciting thing to fuck you on a bus. Let's see how much attention and arousal we can get, and how many, I'm sure we'd have a quick climax if everyone was freaking out and, and they didn't know but again, if that violates the cult taboos to such an extent that it's damaging the ability for love and belonging, not to mention safe sex and all that, then the question is it love or is it just high arousal? And love is the consideration. Will this increase your ability to belong, to have a sense of love and belonging within whatever circle you're participating in? And that varies cult by cult, culture by culture. And so in a loving relationship, that's considered. Self-esteem, again, if someone believes that it is shameful to be in a subservient relationship, but the masculine person in the relationship says, the only way I'm going to let you belong, the only way that I'm going to give you security is if you grovel and, play the sexual slave. Now there's a tension because the self-esteem in the other person says that that's undignified and that's not what I aspire to be. But the sense of love and belonging, okay, well, I'll throw you away and I'll find another slave or deviant or something, that I can do my enactment of my childhood abuse dynamic with, because I don't really care about, loving you or you feeling loved. I just want my rush, which is the next, portal into, something that isn't often explored, which is that our culture splits us into very neat but destructive boxes. This is your professional life. And the first rule in professionalism is you don't have feelings. That's unprofessional. Why? Well, in a chauvinistic cult, it would, of course, be unprofessional to bring femininity to work. And what could be more feminine than the uniqueness of one's empathic feelings? But if everyone decides to agree on the tenets of an abuse cult, and the number one tenet of working is leave your feelings and your personal stuff at home and get the job done, get to the point, get it done fast, all masculine traits, then there's not really any space for the feminine in career, unless you want to be paid less and viewed as unimportant and not the kind of person you want in the important, hard-nosed, competitive, business world, making the deal, putting money ahead of, all these other things, which is in itself a form of chauvinism. So the cult creates pain by boxing things up. For example, don't bring your emotions to work is it's an abuse, it's a lie, because your feelings come to work. But what they're saying is we don't want to acknowledge the feminine part of you in the environment that you're going to spend most of your life. Because as part of an abuse cult, no matter how much money you have, no matter how much survival or security you've created, when you're valued based on your money, which is how Westerners value their value, there is no Fortune 500 list of the kindest people. There's no list of the 500 most effective listeners. There's no list of the most joyful people, because these are feminine traits. Instead, there are lists of people who, however miserable and stodgy, etc., who have the most money, an external metric of masculine success. And so this creates pain for both men and women. And that pain is not responded to as long as one adheres to the tenets of a chauvinistic culture. When that pain is unbearable, coping mechanisms and addictions to work, addictions to perfectionism, addictions to blame, addictions to self-pity, addiction to cocaine, addiction to alcohol, whatever, addiction to anonymous sex. These addictions are necessary lubricants to maintain a culture of chronic pain. And the problem with addictions, be it perfectionism, blame, etc., is that everyone who is in that level of pain puts pain management ahead of being loving to themselves or someone else. Being loving may be to say, fuck this cult. I'm going to bring feelings to my workplace, and I'm going to find a group of people that want to hear my feelings as much as my ideas, and that value who I am as a human being as much as my earning power. And if that means, leaving a fucked up country or, going and living with this marginalized group, because in a dominance hierarchy, the majority will adhere to the cult. So then you're on the margins. And you have all kinds of taboos and shame about alternative. Of course, alternative is not as valuable as the real stuff. Hypnosis was proven to be an effective anesthetic by one London surgeon who amputated a person's leg under hypnosis. But they didn't like that, because materialistic, masculine-based science wanted to say that the mind and the heart and the psychological state had no place in something as masculine and as important as Western medicine. So that was moved off as the alternative. So even though the anesthetics had more side effects, more deaths, cost more, all this, we didn't want to learn about the human mind and learn the art of hypnosis and focus on the human being and the incredible power of the inner world. We wanted to instead talk about the primacy of physical particles. And we don't want to in modern medicine with 15-minute doctor visits, actually learn how people feel. Here's a pill, and if that pill doesn't work, here's another pill. Now I've done my job, because it's all about things. And you don't matter. The fact that your husband is constantly demeaning to you back at home, I don't give a shit about that. Here, take an antidepressant. And when you get addicted to that, I'll switch you to something else. And so you have the whole denigration of the feminine in that domain, and the focus on, alternatives, whether they're better or not by objective measures. So the cult creates pain in all of these different ways, and pain requires either an answer, a response to the pain, which is a change of the cult. But cults are tremendously frightened of change. The primary purpose of every cult is to maintain a status quo that protects frightened people from the unknown. Why not have a tremendously chaotic, divergent, eclectic, and creative cult? No. Let's have a very rigid box of normalcy, and we'll reward everyone who pretends to fit their entire being into that box and who hides all the divergent parts of their personality from public view. And we will punish the shit out of anyone who reveals their uniqueness and diversity, which is, again, nature as an ecological framework rewards diversity, because diversity, biodiversity, wins over monocrops. The Irish potato famine is a great example. Why should millions of people die just because we're too stupid to plant a rich, multiple, mixed crop of a wide variety of vegetables, that none of which will die all out at a single time? Well, we like the idea of dominating nature and pushing this monocrop and having thousands of acres of one type of soybeans and one type of corn, and we'll genetically make them do what we want them to do, and who cares about the soil? This thinking is imposed on relationships with as much viciousness as it is imposed on our planet. And so the diversity and uniqueness of the human being is sacrificed and denigrated with the idea of dominance and making things happening, the rape of the planet, the rape of the feminine. And that pain requires, if it's not answered by saying, I don't want to live this way, I don't like this, it requires higher and higher levels of anesthetic. If you ignore the symptoms of pain and their underlying causes, you need to anesthetize. And sex addiction, opiate addictions, sleep addictions, porn addictions, any one of these things distracts one with an intense physiological burst of energy. And so these can distract a human being from their pain that is not being dealt with directly. Pain is a message always that something's asymmetrical, something's not in balance. So you can either repair the imbalance, which means challenging the cult and healing chauvinism, or you can attack the body's messenger, the signals, with intense stimulation. Now, in a highly chauvinistic cult, the primary method of pain medication is addiction. 1 in 7 Americans are substance addicts, but most Americans are addicted to keeping busy, constant adrenaline to avoid the underlying grief of being so far away from ourselves. Now, the things to understand about an addict is they will always put their pain medicine ahead of their partner and their own well-being, always, because the pain is intense. And the problem with this, and particularly with many addictions, like the addiction to looking good, I've just got to look good. Why? I've got to. Well, wait a minute. Could you spend this time with me here? No, get out of my way. You're making me look bad. Don't do this in public. You have a deep betrayal of the underlying connection and bond of a loving relationship to maintain the addiction to perfection, the addiction to looking good, the addiction to blame. I can't be the one to blame because in my household, the one who was to blame got shamed and punished, and that was so miserable. And I never got over that because there was no point in the cult raising process where someone pulled me aside and said, "You've been abused, and that abuse needs to stop. And so here's what we're going to do. We're going to practice the science of healing trauma and abuse until you get that you can be the person you are without being traumatized to within an inch of your life, psychologically, or physically, sexually." So in a culture of addiction, there will always come a point when the addict has to choose between what's good for the relationship, what's good for themselves, their essential self, and what's good in you, being loving to you and their addiction. And the addict at that point will betray themselves and the relationship to pursue the short-term pain gratification, and you wonder why, you had sex with my best friend and then this, it's like, we had a good relationship. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with the relationship. It's the best relationship I've ever had. I just needed my fix. And I don't know why I did it, because you're an addict. And of course, an addiction is a form of weakness, because control is a masculine trait. Being in flow, being spontaneous, being out of control is the counterpoint, but nobody likes that in a chauvinistic cult. And so you've got to maintain control, which then often means hiding the addiction. And one of the ways that addictions get hid is by saying, "No, I liked this. I should be on opiates. I should be watching 3 or 4 hours of porn. You're interrupting my freedom." And here again, we have the elevation of personal freedom above impact, above the circle, above the planet. If I want to buy a rainforest and cut the shit down and erode into a river and dump oil and kill the natives, that's my right, because I'm a free person and no one's going to get in the way. And we lose track in a very humorous way between the idea of freedom, the right to freedom, and what it's actually used for. I mean, if you understand in the larger hierarchy of human values, and you say, okay, freedom is one of our human values. We all value freedom to one degree or another. But there's an undervaluing. There's an undervaluing of partnering or attuning or letting go of a personal gratification in the moment for something bigger than the self, because the self is deified as an egoic persona in a chauvinistic cult. It's the point. And of course, the point is created by the circle. The chauvinistic individual is created by a chauvinistic cult, but the focus is on the individual. Why did you do this? Why are you a loser? Let's not look at all the economic variables. Let's put all the attention on you. And so the obsession with personal freedom, no one's going to interrupt my movie night. Well, what if I need to talk about feelings that have been brought up by being close to you? Well, you're going to have to deal with that, because I'm an independent person. I'm a liberated woman. I'm a this. I'm not going to. I don't want anyone with any baggage. Aha. So you don't want anyone with any feelings. You don't want anyone with memories. You want a robot. You'd like to have sex with a robot. And many people in the delusions of a chauvinistic cult think that's a great idea. So nice. I don't have to listen to it talk, this. And there's a complete denial of the essential self that lies below that. And that, of course, has feelings, renamed as baggage, or even more harshly as garbage, as the unwanted feminine that is unfortunately attached to the package, the desirable masculine. But in this obsession with freedom, we ignore what most people are doing with that freedom. I have a right to get fat in front of my television watching trash that makes me numb. Okay, so you do. Is that really such an important value, though? If all you use your freedom for is to denigrate yourself, the planet, who cares? Who needs freedom when it is used with that degree of stupidity, with that degree of cruelty on such a regular basis? Maybe it would be a lot better if we had less freedom and more education as a mandate for being an adult. Maybe it would be a good idea if parents had to have a license before exercising their unilateral right to pass on their family abuse constellation to another generation who has no chance of defending themselves from the various torments, shames, humiliations, etc., that those parents are capable of. And so there's this obsession with freedom for the individual, but little concern for the science of impact or the science of well-being, which has a statistical field. Sticking cigarettes in the soles of the feet of the child is going to create shame. It's personally free. We have this, again, the obsession is on the freedom. It's not on how we use the freedom and the consequences on that. I'm going to buy whatever I want when I want it. Yeah, but the consequence is high credit card debts, which lead in a culture that ranks you on money. You're never going to get ahead. And now you feel like shit because you're poor and in debt by a culture that shames you for being in debt, but tells you to go out and spend whatever the fuck you want on whatever you want, when you want it, at whatever color, at all cost, immediately. And so, again, this creates pain. There's lots of double binds here. But the most important thing with this focus on autonomy is it bypasses the essential need to attune to one's partner. If you do not attune to your partner, you will rapidly communicate that you are untrustworthy to the deeper parts of that person, and those deeper parts will stop showing up and the magic will die. So there's a pitfall in personal freedom. And sex opens the heart and mind. Sex opens the heart and mind, which equals sensitivity, which requires container. If you think of liquid as an ice, you have an ice block, which is many of our psychological states. Parts of us are chock blocked of ice. They've been beaten and hammered and frozen into a rigid state. Now, as you bring warmth and attention and attunement and love into that block of ice, it's going to melt. And in the melting, it's going to become more liquid. Another way of looking at it is a metal. A good relationship, and particularly a strong sexuality, will liquefy some of the frozen, rigid parts in the personality of both people if they allow it. Now, the question, once you liquefy a part of the self, is as it recrystallizes, as it takes a new form, will that form be a destructive one or a constructive one? And this is the art of container building. You build a container so that as you liquefy parts of your frozen personality, parts of the wound in that container, you are shaped by the love of your partner, by the love, meaning not the lust and, oh, wouldn't it be great to give you an STI watching you have sex with a stranger? That'd be an entertaining video to send to everyone and ensure a health crisis and blah, blah, blah. But actually someone who is concerned with your survival, your security, your sense of love and belonging, your sense of self-esteem, your deep gifts, and your ability to bring those out into the world. And so if you liquefy in the container of a loving person, and this is the aspect of the positive, nurturing parent, someone that's looking beyond, the obsession and immediate gratification and addiction of the moment to what is good for the development of the relationship and you as a couple and you as individuals, then the liquefaction leads to a healing, leads to becoming more whole. But in a violation dynamic, if you liquefy, you often recrystallize into a lower denigration aspect of shame, because one of the phenomena in a cult that shames its people incessantly on, even the shame of selling advertisement, because the right to advertise is the right to lie to the public. Almost every advertisement is a lie. What an advertiser that wants to make money does is they figure out the images that tell the body that this is a good direction. They hack the biology of the person. So if you're, a Porsche salesman wants to sell you a Porsche, they create beautiful women. Well, you need beautiful bodies and sensitive people in your life. You need that. But now you're thinking that driving a smelly, loud vehicle in traffic is going to give you that. But that's the lie. And of course, they don't show the smoke burning away and the loud hum of the engine and being low to the ground and all that. They show, vistas of traffic-free roads. If you buy a $100,000 Porsche and pollute the environment at an excessively high degree, you will have beautiful women in your life, one, the first lie. And the second is all the traffic will disappear because we'll never show you a Porsche ad stuck in gridlock traffic the way most Porsche drivers in cities are going to find themselves. They clear the traffic for the advertisement, and they subtly try and tell you that if you buy this car, you will have no traffic, and your life will be like this, which is a lie. Now, when you allow the programming of a people through advertisement, what you're saying is we don't care about your map of success. We don't care about the programming that goes into your body that sets you off on a divergent path from well-being. What we care about is a manufacturer's right to trick your body into buying something that decreases your statistical odds of well-being and decreases the planet's statistical odds of well-being. And you can use all the cult, meaning you are emotionally and psychologically illiterate. We have seen to that by avoiding a single hour of effective training in school so that you'd understand how your body works and all that. Now, the advertisers are not psychologically and biologically illiterate and emotionally illiterate. They have studied how your brain works, and they're given the keys to that through various media without any thought to the public. And the question is, who is taking care of the public? Because the message is, you're worth shit. If brainwashing you can make us or make someone else a lot of money, the money is important. Your map of reality is shit. And so this kind of confusion also sabotages relationships, because people find that when they are psychologically and emotionally illiterate and making mistakes one after another that are painful, that they find it seductive to go out and try and make the money to buy a Porsche, and then make the money to buy the Lamborghini, and then make money to buy this big house that nobody's in, because you're off addicting with work and pornography and whatever, and you're not enjoying your rich, intimate friendships. you're addictively seeking to acquire the promise of that through acquisition. And the message of the cult is that's all good business. As long as GDP, as long as we clear off more forests every year, sell more cars every year, then everything's great, which is a chauvinistic version of well-being. And so this is a pitfall, that as people get nervous in actual relationships, and every day there's a new advertisement saying, go out and make money doing stuff you don't like that hurts the planet and blah, 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 and then spend the money buying stuff that promises you something that is a lie. People can get sidetracked into that, obsession of acquisition. But sex opens up a liquidity in the psyche, and we don't know how to hold container for that. Up, I've got to go. And yet, the deeper the emotional and psychological state within the relationship, the more important it is to honor the responsibility to build a container so that that liquid is held. If you think of ice going into water, if you create a beautiful glass statue and you pour that water in, you become, and your partner becomes, beautiful. If you create an ugly mess, the water evaporates and you feel diminished on the other side, and you don't know why, or you feel ugly. You liquefied, and now you find yourself being treated as the butt of abuse, because it is the feminine that has the capacity to become liquid. But the feminine takes the shape of the masculine, both inside and out, that is in its environment when it is liquefied. And if that shape is a chauvinistic shape, then as one becomes liquid in what could be a transcendent state towards feminine beauty, instead one will wake up and say, I don't like who I am at all. I've been turned in to the butt of a joke. Now, most of us don't know what container is. And in the modern world, with the obsession of freedom and everyone pursuing their own addiction and all that, the higher ranking person is often the person, I don't like attachments. I don't want to be tied down. I like doing what I want, when I want, however I want, fucking where I want, fucking who I want, married. Who gives a shit? Who gives a shit? It's what I want now. And there's no understanding of the time, of the agreement, of the conscious design of a culture that would actually allow people, as they warm up in the relationship container, to take the shape of something beautiful and thoughtful that is held by the couple as sacred and more important than the personal obsession or exercise of addictive freedom in the moment. The sexual container that works versus the cultural container. The sexual container, the deeper you go together, the more you need to prioritize the relationship to hold that third energy that is born. But the cultural container says you kind of fit that in when you have time. And if you look at the energetic container as an organic material like a plant, you don't get to decide when you water lettuce. The needs of lettuce decide when you water lettuce. If you want tender, beautiful lettuce, you seed it, you cover it with a gauze, you help it germinate. You water it a couple of times a day lightly. You prepare the soil and you get delicious lettuce. Now, the chauvinism of the cult wants to say to the personas in a relationship, the equivalent of that lettuce, no. We're going to give you what we want to give you. Lettuce, we're going to water you once a month when we're going to flood you, and you better grow. And if you don't, you're a bad lettuce. And so we do this with our inner personas. They give birth and they develop and blossom in a sexual relationship in close proximity. And we say, I've got to go. I'm going on a road trip for my freedom, of course. Or I've got to go. Work is, of course, more important than feelings or relationship containers. So if you're a decent, intelligent, modern person, you will respect my work at all costs. And the fact that it allows the closeness, the vulnerability, the trust of the inner personas to wither. You come home after 30 days of not watering lettuce and it's dead. But in a psychologically illiterate culture, you come home after 30 days of negating your partner and you're angry at the partner for not being warm and open to you like they would have been if you had attended them daily. And you decide that they're not sophisticated enough. And it's very important to make this distinction between the organic parts of the psyche that have their own rhythm, much like lettuce or a sequoia or anything else, and the dogma of the culture that in its ignorance says lettuce should be nice and plump and rich and edible. I'm just not going to water it because I've got to work. And then lectures the lettuce. Don't you understand? I had to work. You know, we're not that dumb in the physical terrain, in part because we're materialistic. So we would blame the gardener in the case of the lettuce. But we often blame the victim of our neglect and abuse rather than taking the time to understand that this type of relationship at this degree of emotionality and vulnerability requires this amount of water, this amount of praise, this amount of attention, this amount of quality time, or it will die. Period. And if you want that in your relationship, you need to shift the culture, the environment, so that you can co-create and nurture that degree of trust and trustworthiness, vulnerability, magic, etc. The next thing is, the chauvinism of, the modern feminist, which is, of course, saying we can be more masculine than men and are therefore equal or better than men in a framework of competition and dominance, where if men have dominated in this direction, now we as women are going to dominate even more or just as well, and that's the whole goal. But this fails to address the underlying cultural chauvinism, which is really harming both men and women in their feminine, and often harming men in their femininity more than it is harming women, because women, though denigrated for their femininity, are tolerated and accepted, and women are allowed to be affectionate with other women without being, shamed. And so women tend to have more friends, which is actually more healthy. In the United States in recent years, middle-aged white male suicides have overtaken car accidents as the leading cause of death and reduced the life expectancy because there's no one aspiring to be an excellent listener in a culture that desperately needs to be listened to. There's no one aspiring to understand a culture that's shouting but not taking the time to let another person in. So the feminine in a chauvinistic cult is minimized and is in short supply in both men and women, while it is being ranked low. So the reward, it's very similar to an electrical equation where you've got 1,000 plugs and one outlet. What do you need more of? More plugs or more outlets? The plugs are useless without an outlet. You can scream, and it's meaningless if no one listens. The masculine is irrelevant without the feminine, be that femininity in a woman or in a man. And when we incentivize the culture to rank the highest masculine traits as the ideal, we train people to compete to be more and more masculine at the same time, where what we truly need is more and more femininity. And unfortunately, most of the feminist movement has not been reclaiming the rights of women to be feminine and valued in their femininity, and to value the femininity in men. Some of the feminist bitches are the cruelest to the femininity in men and in women, and are the most vicious at cutting that down in themselves and then in everyone around them, and shaming people for not being feminine because they're tired of being viewed as second-class people in a chauvinistic cult. And so they're competing to be more masculine than men, and to shame the women who are bringing what little healthy feminine energy is still present in the chauvinistic cult. And I have personally been attacked, betrayed, denigrated in my feminine self by women aspiring to embody, this new sense of feminism, where we can be as fuck all, autocratic and stupid as the men have been for thousands of years, and that'll make us valuable. And so this fails to address the deeper issue of the masculine-feminine balance within the cult and its underlying bias. Fear of feelings is a very common result, particularly when sex happens too fast, which is very common and actually in a materialistic cult. The sex is viewed as, of course, the most important thing. And it, of course, is not. Conversation, flow, engagement, the degree of respect, meaning understanding and attunement to the complexity of the other people, and coming together in a growing depth, is, of course, what you're doing all the time. And sex usually doesn't account for more than about 2 hours a week in relationship. And in many cases, this protocol of abuse kills off the trust and trustworthiness of the vulnerable parts to come forward, so there's no juice left. If you want to find and extract a last little bit of juice, you got to whip and chain and drop candle wax and do this and that and the other, just to create enough arousal to get off, because we've raped and murdered the feminine to such an extent that that's about all you can do to extract a few drops of moisture, out of cold, hard, barren soil. This fear of feelings, which is the fear of being caught in the feminine and shamed, often leads people in a chauvinistic culture to retreat. Of course, that creates abandonment and escalated feelings in the partner, which is how the shame is transferred. When you shame feelings and say, I don't want to feel them, so I'm going to retreat, all of my feelings of fear get transferred over to you, who are being abandoned. When you pursue someone who is afraid of being caught in their feelings, it is an expression of need and of value of the feminine. And so you set yourself up to be shamed and patronized for being in the feminine state. So you pursue someone, which often elicits a certain fear or guilt of those feelings. So often the response of an emotionally illiterate human being in our culture is to attack and do deliberately hurtful things if the partner pursues someone as they withdraw. And this brings up, an important vulnerability, which is that many aspects of relationship reduce to the lowest common denominator. And so, for example, it takes two to say yes to being loving as an adult. It takes one to say no. Fuck it, I'm out of here. One to say no, two to say yes. Well, what do you do if you're a yes to a healthy, deep relationship, but your partner is too immature and walks away? That part of you that grew in the relationship dies as a general phenomena, because that was unique. That persona was born to engage with that particular person and attuned to that particular person, and they're not there. So there's no water to keep that part of you alive, and it dies. There's a grieving process, which brings up a problem in a culture that doesn't know how to grieve, that doesn't even understand the basics of the 5 stages, let alone practice it publicly. You will not spend a single hour in high school or college learning to grieve, though you will lose many things, including your femininity. And that grief process, frozen in ignorance, shame, and fear, becomes a sociopathic wall that destroys empathy, that destroys the capacity to feel. So what do you do when you do feel, and all you feel is the coldness of someone's wall? It creates a downward spiral where the few people left feeling are in the most pain, but they're feeling everyone else's pain that they're not feeling because they entered a sociopathic state when there was no outlet for their grief, and so the pain and the loss is frozen in a catatonic state. It takes 2 to say yes, 1 to say no. It takes 1 to leave. It takes 1 to say no. It takes 1 to betray. You got something good going, someone's uncomfortable with the femininity emerging. They suddenly go out of their way to forget an anniversary, to refuse to answer their phone, to do everything possible to say, get the fuck out of here. And then you confront them on that, and they're like, no, I feel great. I'm just being myself. I'm just exercising my freedom by violating the law of empathy, the law of attunement. Men, just as much as women, have feminine needs. They need acceptance. They need value. They need a sense of love and belonging. They need a sense of pleasure. And they need the integration of sexual release. However, within chauvinism, the only doorway available to a man is sex. And so there is a desperate need for sex as the avenue of getting in touch with these feelings without being shamed, because to express those feelings in any other context is unmanly. So this creates an incredible need while avoiding their feminine side and while betraying the relationship. And so this creates a dynamic where more and more women don't want to be used and then dumped. And so they withhold that, which increases the man's desperation in a chauvinistic cult, because they need that release of a dignified aspect into the feminine. And some need the machismo of, counting women they're having sex with and all that. And of course, the more women are treated that way, the less women are interested emotionally and biologically in that type of relationship. So you have more and more people on the planet, but less and less people feeling an abundance of love and belonging and an abundance of sex. And as the traditional family, somewhat patronizing protocol of marriage and little woman domesticity, evaporates, men don't know what to do. And so the hostility that many men feel comes from this place of, if I acknowledge my vulnerability, I will be shamed by the chauvinistic women and the chauvinistic men, and marginalized at work, etc. If I acknowledge the needs that I have, I do have these needs, and so I'm angry and I'm hurt, and I want to hurt women. And many women growing up in an abuse cult at home have confused love with hurt. And so there's a mutual agreement, that we'll have this relationship and it's love because I'm hurting you and I'm letting you hurt me. And there's even an attraction to that. There's a higher arousal template, but there's a confusion of the difference between sexuality and love. The other kind of pitfall in a deeper growing relationship, particularly a marriage, there's something about the meanings in the word marriage. It's about becoming one. And in a cult that treats the inner self like shit and treats the inner feminine like shit, when you're separate, when you're out there, there's a general default in this cult to say who I am as a human being is a piece of shit. Because my government, my parents, my culture, my school has all treated me that way 10,000 ways. But the romantic out there, the other, oh, they're cool, they're mysterious because they're separate from me. I'm worthless, they're valuable. The product is valuable, the package is valuable. Oh, they're so perfect because they're not like me. And so this creates an incredibly frustrating dynamic, particularly since 95% of the pursuing that goes on is by men. Men see this cool other person, and they're left with the job of pursuing it, the mysterious other, etc. And so they pursue and they pursue and they pursue, and as part of chauvinism, the outer body is valued more than the inner self. And so a male will be considered higher ranking to pursue a younger, fertile, large-breasted, symmetrically faced, blonde, whatever. That's the target. So then there's all these young women who, of course, have no idea what they're doing in an emotionally illiterate culture, being pursued by men of all ages as this elusive other. And the older women who have a lot more inner maturity and inner value, this is the side of the feminine in men and women that is the inner world. So the older women are more self-aware, they're more self-accepting, they're more empathic, they're more nurturing. An older woman will often love her inner child more than a younger woman who's desperately trying to hide anything that strikes as being uncool. So the older woman is marginalized and denigrated, even more so in Asia. At 40 years old, if I try and date an Asian woman who's 40, she thinks there's something wrong with me. Why do you want me? I'm old. You should be wanting a 20-year-old bimbo. But that ageism, which pervades the culture, and of course, with all sociopathic and chauvinistic expressions, it's completely hypocritical because older women are supposed to like older men, and older men are supposed to like younger women. So it's asymmetrical. When I dated a 58-year-old plump woman who I had great communication dynamics with when I was 26, she was, of course, twice my age. Everyone thought it was weird. And I had to deal with being looked at as something's wrong with you for not valuing tits and ass over intelligence and self-awareness and good communication. This is not, of course, understood the other way around. If I'm a 58-year-old male, of course I'd be interested in a 26-year-old woman because the external body is the package. That's what it's all about. But continuing the saga, when the man finally catches up with his mystical prize, And they get closer and they get closer and you get married. And at some point you realize we're one. And this is the problem. This is, the big problem with marriage in a psychologically illiterate culture, is you're a piece of shit and the other person's valuable because they're different from you. That's the kind of internal awareness and attraction, is they're different. But then you get close to them and you realize they're not better than you. But rather than transcending the self-image of the abused child of being a piece of shit whose inner femininity is worthless, you drag the other person down, saying, I'm worthless, I'm a piece of shit. And now that I've gotten close to you, you're just like me. You're just as neurotic. You're just as obsessed with this. You make mistakes. You do your hair this way. You spend all the... I see you. You're no longer attractive because now you're like me and I'm not attractive. And this is incredibly frustrating for women because it tells them that the only way they can be adored is to have nothing to do with men, which was a dynamic I experienced with my father. I noticed by about age 15 or 20 that he valued people in direct proportion for how much they wanted nothing to do with him. And so I became the prized child because I had nothing to do with my father. So I would hear indirectly how much he praised me, but I had nothing to do with him. Meanwhile, he terrorized and blamed and attacked everyone in his life because the very fact that they, much like I think it was George Burns who said I would never be in a club that would have me as a member. The very fact of wanting to be close to Dad would mean that you're a piece of shit just like him. If you wanted nothing to do with him, you must be valuable. And so I was the valuable one because I had nothing to do with him. And it was incredibly frustrating. And I remember making an effort to get close to him and being treated worse and just deciding, okay, that's your law. The closer I am, the more you're going to hurt me. So women are in this incredibly frustrating position of understanding that their only value is that they are unknown and that they say no. That as soon as they say yes, they go down in value, and as soon as they get close, they go down in value more. And as soon as they're married, you're a piece of garbage, and I'm not interested in you, and I'm off seeking the romantic other. And this is, of course, absolutely, a torture cell for so many people, and you'll learn absolutely nothing about it. Because, of course, feminine terrains like relationships are not worth teaching anyone about. And I've also found with a variety of women who put me on pedestals, I like being praised. And so if a woman says, wow, you're so amazing and blah, 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 I say, okay, let's get together. And they're like, wait a minute. I never thought you, being so amazing, would be interested in me, who's a piece of shit. It's like, no, you're not a piece of shit. Well, I know I'm a piece of shit. So you must be more valueless than I thought because you're interested in me. And so they immediately start treating me worse to the degree that I assure them that they are okay. Because that just means I have terribly low standards in their eyes if they are acceptable within those standards. And so by the time I get close, they're abusing me. And if I get rid of them, they immediately put me up on a pedestal and said, I knew it. He was good. He's too good for me. So we'll treat him well because he'll have nothing to do with me. And I've even had that dynamic in a dating. I remember dating a therapist, a psychotherapist, an award-winning author and all that. And I wrote to her and she ignored my email. And I said, I'm looking for a meaningful, intense relationship. You haven't responded even once in days. I think you're too busy, so I'm going to say goodbye. Well, she wrote back within hours. Because I had rejected her, suddenly I was it. Now, when we got together and I was close, she rejected that as well. When she read my book and realized that, in her eyes, I had a brilliant mind, then she was all over me, but I wasn't interested in her. It's like you've rejected everything feminine in me, everything meaningful in my spontaneity, and you're just interested in my book. I mean, what kind of an idiot likes someone's book more than they like the person? A well-trained, well-educated female chauvinist will value the mind of a human being more than the actual felt experience of a human being, because the mind is partitioned and elevated. And this is torture for both people, but it's part of the crisis of becoming one. If you cannot love who you are, once you become one, you will start abusing the other person as thoroughly as you abuse yourself, which most of us are trained to do. In the childhood abuse dynamic, where the child that stands up for their dignity is beaten psychologically, physically, etc., as having the sass to have a boundary with the abusive parent who often doesn't have boundaries. And withdrawal around mistakes. One of the things that goes on in relationships is we may abuse someone and realize that there was something beautiful in them, but we don't know how to be anywhere way else. So we feel a certain guilt or shame around that. Someone may also invite abuse. I've been in multiple relationships where I didn't like the dynamic. It didn't feel fully respectful to her. Meaning I didn't feel like I was able to respect her the way she deserved. And she said, oh, no. Of course I'm an irritating person, blah, blah, blah. Go ahead, but don't leave me. Go ahead, abuse me, but don't leave me. And I felt crappy about myself. I didn't know how to change the dynamic other than to leave, because other women didn't encourage me to abuse them. They communicated a certain value, and it's one of the reasons I've appreciated older women. Is you discover that the surface is not as valuable as the deeper self. But in that dynamic, sometimes someone will leave because they feel bad. They don't know what they're doing. But again, a man, as part of chauvinism, will be shamed and shame themselves for not knowing. Why do men drive around without asking for directions? I mean, thank goodness they have Google Maps now. But why do they drive around? Because it is considered feminine to need help. And you can't ask a woman where to go, because that's not cool, that's not sexy. That's breaking the facade of the superior male who, of course, knows everything all the time without learning anything, and will pontificate endlessly about stuff they know nothing about, rather than admit that they don't know. Because to not know something is to be in mystery, is to be in the unknown. And despite the fact that 99.9% of reality is unknown, I don't want to be there. I don't want to acknowledge that there's anything I don't know. And this relationship has taken me into terrain where I don't know. And I don't want to ask for help, because that's weak, because that's feminine. And women will do the same thing, particularly macho career girls, out there. I'm badass and this and that. And I'm not going to ask my partner the most basic and simple attuning question. How am I doing? Is this good for you? How could I do a better job? What am I doing well and what am I not doing well? The basic questions of partnering and attuning cannot be asked within a chauvinistic paradigm because they are admissions of inadequacy. Because the perfect masculine person knows everything. They're in control always. And so you have the stupidity of US presidents as well. Bombing the shit out of this, escalating terrorism in the world with a war on terror, all kinds of stuff. But they'll never apologize because that would be weak and unpresidential in a chauvinistic cult. And so you have people abandoning and withdrawing from relationships because they don't know what they're doing. They feel bad about it. And they're not willing to ask for help. So they just leave. And they transfer their inadequacy to ask for help onto their partner, who invariably, and it's very sad, when I leave a woman because, and I'll usually be right up, I don't know how to navigate this terrain and bring out the best in you and the best in me. I don't know how to do it. I know how to do it with this other woman. I don't know how to do it here. The objectification of women, which is another form of chauvinism, invariably gets communicated to a body failing, meaning women have been shamed and pulverized into believing that if they don't have perfect bodies, they're inadequate. And it's fascinating. I had a massage this evening, and my wife overheard me laughing with the masseuse. And what was going on was the masseuse had had a long day and was a bit grumpy. And I didn't want grumpy energy being put in my body. And so I deliberately joked around with her to bring her into a lightened state so that she could put light in my body rather than, stress and, all that. Well, my wife heard the masseuse laughing behind the curtain. And she had a fit. And what was interesting is where she goes with that. The masseuse has bigger breasts than my wife, which I could give a shit about. All the data is 100% clear. I have never picked a woman based on breast size or age or anything like that. Most of the women I've dated have been older than me. This is complete and utter nonsense. But some part of my wife is going to make dark comments denigrating her own breasts because she's in a delusion fostered by the cult that is impenetrable by data and impenetrable. I think we've had the conversation probably 20 times. It doesn't touch the region where that wound was slashed into her. She watched people being humiliated by men who would leave their partners and then blame the partner they left for having some inadequate body part. And that trauma stung. So even though I've never done that, doesn't matter. That's what she hears. So the externalization, a man leaves because he's inadequate to navigate the terrain emotionally. And the woman concludes that the other woman, if there even is one, is better. What? They're younger, they're whatever, and does this upset, but it's not the right story. And even, and I think some men are so ashamed of not knowing that when the woman makes up the story, they'll go along with it to cover the fact that they don't possibly know what they're doing, and they don't want to admit it. And so they'll agree with the default woman's thing that, yep, she had nicer ass and da-da-da-da-da, and say, yeah, that's why I had to leave you. It couldn't possibly be because I didn't know what I'm doing. And so that wound goes on, particularly as as every woman loses her looks and every man becomes distinguished. Yet another absurd expression of chauvinism, simply by arbitrarily defining women's looks as being appropriate in the 20s and men's looks being appropriate in the 50s or whatever. And then, of course, many women shame young men who are as emotionally illiterate as they are, if not more, because men get the brunt of chauvinism towards the feminine. And so they are the most regressed emotionally. What is hated and unloved in a human being becomes regressed and ceases to develop. And what is hated in many of our men is the vulnerability, the tenderness of the feminine self. And so that part gets regressed. Sometimes men stay teenagers for life emotionally because their feminine was so brutalized at that time. And the cult leaves them in a regressed, unsupported state. And then, they go out and the adolescent version is to have sex with as many people as possible because that ranks value. And nobody knows how to deal with this situation, which causes enormous pain on both sides. But I've witnessed any number of cases of younger women shaming younger men by calling them boys and saying, oh, I want an older, more experienced man and all that, but not necessarily being mature or self-aware themselves, but nonetheless shaming, the young man, who usually assumes that it's about money. When I think really, most people, the reason I chose an older woman at age 26 was I wanted someone in the relationship who knew what they were doing. And I knew I didn't. And she'd spent time with 100 lovers and was a great conversationalist. And so, I wanted someone who knows what they're doing. I think many women, the chemistry flows if someone knows what they're doing. The problem is that we as a cult do not teach our young men what to do, how to navigate their own psyche or partner to create great relationships. And it doesn't teach women either. It's just that younger women will tend to be courted by older men more than younger men will be courted by older women. And as a result of that process, the woman may develop sexually and psychologically more in the care of an older man, so that by the time she's 30, she may have a lot more experience of a mature relationship than a young man who's never been courted, by a 50 or 60-year-old woman and learned what love is, or, basic stuff like that. And because men are very regressed emotionally because of the degree of shame and chauvinism, they're often much more sensitive. I'm incredibly sensitive to humiliation by a woman. And young women think nothing of it, which is another thing I appreciate about older women. And so, when they feel shamed for the inadequacy foisted upon them by their cult, meaning these men are not inadequate by nature. They're inadequate, raised within a chauvinistic abuse cult, and the various cycles that go into play. And to try and move into emotionality and sensitivity and be shamed and, kicked back by sociopathic women who are tired of feeling inadequate themselves, often turns some of these men into, I'm going to get those women, I'm going to fuck them, I'm going to make them feel like shit, and I'm going to leave them. And so it trains sociopathic men who have felt humiliated and small by too many young women. And that's not good either. And it's important to understand these dynamics as well as the dynamics of, the fact that the physiology of a person is attracted to to their face. Symmetry is a big thing, symmetrical teeth and all that. These are just random accidents of birth. But some women are just going to be flooded with, the basic gene and development things, which, you're not going to have kids with most of the people you're connected with. So the symmetry is not as essential as the biology points out. But there's also a dynamic that many women who happen to have highly developed aesthetic bodies, for whatever reason, luck of the draw, are so preyed upon and pampered by a variety of men that they do not develop psychologically and emotionally because they don't have to. They're treated like babies with sugar daddies and this and that. And so they're a complete nightmare to actually have a relationship with. And the cruelest thing with this dance is they're doted on until they're 35 or something, and then they're suddenly dumped as their pheromones and all that shift. And now they're completely incompetent. And they were the princess that whole 35 years, and now suddenly they're worthless because they didn't develop on the inside and their bodies have betrayed them with old age. And the more it goes on, and then, staying in an adolescent, living the glory days, you have the sadness of this happening, where the most attractive women are set up for chronic, loneliness and shame in old age. Often compensate by throwing themselves at the hunk, etc., that they related to in their youth, and being used as sex objects and not as human beings. So there's a tremendous tragedy in this wheel of relational ignorance, and no adult, as a general rule, is going to take a child aside and explain any of this, which is giving the message that heartbreak, shame, betrayal, and abuse throughout your life is just fine, as long as you have a job and are making more and more money while you're being abused, abandoned, neglected, and lonely. Then, as any good chauvinist would say, you're making progress.